welcome back to our questions with Kirsty, and we've reached question 7, which is, does the Northern Ireland Protocol impact at all on our pathways to Europe after independence?
I think it does, though not necessarily in the way that people often assume or hope. I think some people in Scotland hope that if a deal is done with the Northern Ireland Protocol, that it kind of will show how easy borders can be. But I think you have to remember that this is a very specific deal. Yes. Northern Ireland, for the moment, is part of the UK, the Good Friday Agreement, and so on and so forth. Scotland is going to be an independent state, like Ireland or France or Netherlands, and applying to join the EU. So if you're looking at what to learn about borders for an independent Scotland, you need to look at how the UK trades with Ireland or how the UK trades with France, not at how it trades with a part of the UK called Northern Ireland. So in that sense, it doesn't tell us anything. But I think, you know, we don't know what's going to happen in the election in 2 years' time. But if Labour came in, I think we know that there would be agreements on sensible things like animal and plant health and food criteria, which would immediately take a lot of the bureaucracy away, not only from the Northern Ireland Protocol, but if you agreed it across the board with all the EU 27, it would ease all borders. So even if the Truss government did a deal on the Northern Ireland Protocol, but only applied it to Northern Ireland, that wouldn't necessarily ease other borders. But if anything applies to the whole EU, that will certainly help. And so whatever one thinks of Labour or a Starmer government, some of the things that they might be likely to do would help. But I think more of concern for Scotland is there a deal done on the Northern Ireland Protocol? Or is there a huge row which conceivably could end up in a trade war? It could conceivably end up in the EU suspending the trade and cooperation agreement. And again, that's going to depend on timings and on when a Scottish independence referendum happens. But, you know, in that scenario, we'd end up trading with the EU on World Trade Organization terms. Whereas if it's been solved, I mean, you know, we're recording this on the day of this quite extraordinary deregulatory mini budget. So this looks like an absolutely out of control, gung-ho ideological government. And also if it deregulates as much as it says it's going to do, that's also going to threaten the trade deal with the EU, you know, because Boris Johnson promised a so-called level playing field. If there's a deal on the Northern Ireland Protocol, there will be better relationships between the EU and UK. President Macron had this idea of a wider so-called European political community, and it's going to have its first tentative meeting at the start of October in Prague. And at the moment, Liz Truss hasn't said if she'll go or not. And I think the assumption had been the UK wouldn't go. But if it does go, again, that's about better relations. So I think there's a political dividend for an independent Scotland, actually, if the UK is getting on better with its neighbours, and then there's a political negative if it's getting on really badly and the trade deal has been upended. And that obviously impacts on the currency question as well. If the pound is collapsing and stays collapsed for a couple of years, I assume the SNP will look again at its policy.
I mean, it's hard to tell, isn't it? You know, it's with well, it's not a new government in Westminster, but with certainly a shift over to the right wing and a new prime minister. What we've heard her say over the last few months, she's been talking to Tory party members, you know, so that's who she was talking with to get them to elect her as their leader. So in a way, we haven't heard maybe too much about, you know, what would be in her real life as a prime minister. But I know you're strong. You kind of feel strongly like she cannot afford to just ignore the EU.
Yes, and I think in terms of the Northern Ireland dimension of that, Liz Truss, as Foreign Secretary, introduced in June the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which threatens to overrule some elements of that international agreement, overrule some of the border controls that Boris Johnson knowingly agreed and signed as an international agreement, and take away the role of the European Court of Justice. So the EU, that Brussels are trying to play this very calmly, not to create a crisis, to keep offering ways to simplify the border to Northern Ireland and so on and so forth. But what they've made very clear is if the Northern Ireland bill goes through, and it's due in the Lords in October, it's already had its second reading in the House of Commons, that it will have to act. So I think something to look at in the coming months is there a deal? And I mean, Liz Truss could slow down the passage of this bill, so it gives them more and more time, but she can't slow it down forever. And the problem is she's very much in hock to the far right of the Tory party and the European Research Group and so on. So does she put relations with the US as well as the EU and peace in Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland ahead of keeping her supporters on the Tory backbenches happy? I mean, Boris Johnson threatened to do this with his internal market bill 2 years ago that also had clauses that would have overruled the deal with the EU, and he took them out because, I mean, he was a great one for, going to the edge and then stepping back. We don't know yet if Liz Truss will do that. She said on her way to the UN there wasn't going to be a US-UK trade deal, which is like, so what was Brexit for? Well, maybe it was for this mad deregulatory budget today. But the UK is relatively isolated after Brexit, and its relationship with the US in security terms, especially at the time of the Ukraine war, is extremely important. And she will have got a very clear message from Biden on the Northern Ireland Protocol. But we don't know. We will have to wait and see. But that's the one to watch. Does the bill go through? In which case, we are on very, very tricky ground economically and politically. Not only in Northern Ireland, but in relations to the EU, the pound investment, everything. Or does she follow a rational path? And I can't call that one.
We just don't know. I know, and it's not exactly reassuring to hear her saying how great a system trickle-down economics is when all the evidence is that it has never worked. It's led to a lot of inequality. But
no, and I think on that, what they're doing is, at the macro level, they're vastly increasing debt and then giving much more money to the rich than the poor. There's no reason to think, that will stimulate growth. What will stimulate growth? And of course, she doesn't seem to talk about climate friendly or sustainable growth, but we know it's about investment, infrastructure, investment in people, in social infrastructure, as well as business investment. It's a complicated, you need that detail to increase productivity. You don't just need rich bankers getting richer. And the pound has already fallen to a decades long low, and I think it's going to fall further. And even with the energy package she's proposed, there's going to be inflation and pressure on living standards. There's going to be lots of strikes and unrest. They're also going to limit the right to strike. They're attacking people on benefits again. So we're heading into an extraordinary period in the UK. I mean, it's in many ways extraordinary in the rest of Europe because of the energy prices and Russia's attack on Ukraine. But the idea that with 2 years to go to an election, we're in this mad sort of deregulatory rush and crumbling NHS, crumbling infrastructure, climate targets, everything's going out the window. And so you add to that what we're talking about today, the EU-UK crisis and relations and so forth. It looks extremely chaotic and unstable ahead, is what I would say. And so then you bring, you say, well, what if in 2 years, well, we're going to have a general election and that's going to be a referendum of sorts, but it's not going to, well, we're going to see politically what pressure that might put on the UK government. But in 2 or 3 years' time, what might an independent Scotland look like compared to the state of the UK? And we don't know. So coming back to your very first question of borders, well, what is the UK's relationship with the EU going to look like in 2 or 3 years' time? Is it going to be relatively sane and sensible? Is there still going to be a trade and cooperation agreement? might the borders been made less hard through a Labour government, or is there going to be an ongoing trade war? And so the circumstances in which Scotland may be becoming independent and looking at its own border with England, there's different paths, aren't there?
Yeah, every now and again I think, oh, if only we'd done it in 2014, what a different position we would be in now.
Well, and I always suspect that if that had happened, if Scotland had gone for independence in 2014, there wouldn't have been a Brexit vote.
Yeah.
So that was today's question, and perhaps not the answer we were expecting. Quite an interesting answer, I thought.
Yeah.
What have we got for tomorrow, Marlene?
When we'd made this recording, the British Social Attitudes Survey had just been published. It's from last year. Huge survey that's done, and that's apparently gold standard in terms of its methodology. And it's the one that showed that there was now 52% support for yes. So we just talk a bit about that, but Kirsty herself goes into other polls and what they're showing. So that's tomorrow.